you've managed teams, small teams, all the way up to large organizational groups. The distinction, the difference, that balance between what you're talking about and disconnect of leadership in terms of what it is that managers and directors really are doing. I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
The management models that we have largely in our culture now, especially Western culture, are from Industrial Revolution. We've seen more and more literature come out and research around how this is changing, probably needs to change. But these things are really systemically rooted and they take a long time to kind of churn out. So if I go into any organization looking to like significantly overhaul that, I'm going to have a lot of frustration and a lot of resistance. So a lot of it is looking for opportunities to push the envelope a little bit to mature and evolve. But I have some advantage maybe in that I didn't start my career in typical corporate America. It was in a very people-centric space where I was trying to figure out, assessing where things were at, what was impacting negative and positively, how to move to a positive place. I wasn't really preoccupied in my early career with being in charge or in control. I was usually, what's the environment? What's the landscape? What's in play? And so I would have a broader view and I would think more systemically. There's not a large leap in my mind from family systems theory that I might have had when I was in grad school to organizational development and looking at how organizations function, because there's a lot of similarities. But again, it's people, no matter in either context. I think there are folks that subscribe to the management model of being in control, and some organizations are really firm about that's the job. I think I'm a fan of seeing how far we can get a team of people to being kind of self-managing, so to speak, meaning they can be clear on what they need to get done. They can be effective in getting those things done. They can work well together and actually help each other improve and grow and back each other up. So the performance actually goes up and often can exceed the initial task or job at hand and go beyond that. Oftentimes, if you have really, I think, high control environments with managers, if it's a little more factory floor oriented, like your job is to put 20 widgets on a pallet every day, and you do that. And then maybe you optimize and you get 21 on a pallet the next day. But that's stationary. It's not very adaptive. It's just kind of mechanical. Some people love those jobs. Some people are built for those jobs, and it comes from the manufacturing models that heavily influenced our world in organizations. But as companies become more into knowledge working spaces, and people aren't literally packing pallets, they're doing stuff in their heads. So it's hard to track that, which creates some ambiguity. So I think when there's change in organization and people are doing knowledge work, there's higher level of anxiety with leadership about what's going on, what's effective. And I think that triggers a whole bunch of other behaviors that translate sometimes into really not effective management expectations. And one of the things that I've felt most strongly about is I've watched organizations struggle in their growth and struggle with figuring out how to, especially in the technology side, get technologists into management roles they may or may not even want.
Yeah.
Part of me is like, who do they look to for the right model? Because the old models are starting to kind of decay and fail, and new models need to replace them, and that will take time. But what are those new models? That's a space that's always kind of fascinated me. And I think it has its pros and cons, but I've had the opportunity to live in a somewhat of an open, not super structured experience base with some of the consulting we've done in the organizations we've been in, where certain leaders would look at my approach and really value it. Others would look at it and be totally confused because I wasn't following the typical hard-nosed manager 101 rule book. And sometimes there was kind of an autoimmune response to that when I wasn't doing those things. But I think it's kind of the price you pay for being on the edge of advancing and evolving people and organizations. Long answer.
Yeah. There's probably an inherent logical fallacy in a lot of organizations as a result of what you're describing, where because a manager may be perceived as not being in control or in charge, that they're redundant and not necessary. And what was interesting about what you were describing is that you're basically saying, well, no, a good manager's goal is that they aren't necessary, that they're basically giving the team the ability to run without them having to manage every element of that. And that's a sign of success. We've chatted with you about it, so you're familiar with the concept of the hidden chasm. Mm-hmm. Do you want to take a swing in your own words or from your perspective? How you
So my view on this is interesting because I immediately think about the people component, and like an organization might be thinking about technical debt or architectural debt when they're kind of racing towards the chasm. I'm thinking about people debt, which, and in things like, somewhere I've got a long list of corollaries here, but for an example, organizationally, from a technical perspective, you might be taking shortcuts. You're not working the code through in a more mature way, and you're like, I'll come back and fix that later. Sometimes we do the same thing with people where we need to upskill, but we're running too fast. Like, we just got to get a different person in here. Okay. So you just start short circuiting for near-term expectations and demands. So I think for a lot of pieces that are part of what we'd see as technical architectural debt conversations, I think there's a very human counterpart. And then how you solve that, I think, is a mix of things. But there's definitely a piece, and I think at the end of the day, I think people forget that organizations they're just run by people.
We've been approaching that element of the conversation as skills gaps and strategic misalignments and organizational issues, which, I mean, to your point, sort of obfuscates the core of that, which is you're talking about people. It's not some ethereal organizational thing, it's people.
We get caught up in our language a lot, and there's certainly business jargon. I heard a term last week. A guy named Bob Sutton, I think, out of Stanford, is writing a new book called The Friction Project. That's kind of fascinating, but I was watching him be interviewed, and I think what was the term they were using our language? It was the idea of jargon monoxide. Like, you just kind of pollute the air you're breathing with how we're talking about things. But I think a lot of what some of this speaks to is something I feel like I've kind of, at my core, I do a lot, but it probably has never been in a job description or contract, which is I'm helping to make connections between an external environment of the business and what they need to get done with people's internal stuff. So whether I'm working with a new manager or a mid-level or senior technologist, there's sometimes it's just difficult connecting. Their performance may be very much impacted because, they're lost in a bunch of chaos. They can't make sense of what their role is or why they're there.
Something you said too about people debt, something that makes me incredibly angry in organizations when I see it is ignoring the upskilling or not allocating and focusing on the necessity of that throughout the year, allocating some sort of capacity of their utilization over the week or over the months to say, let's talk about what's going on in the space that we're in the industry. Let's talk about how it's evolving and where it's going. Even though we're here, even though we're not moving, we may not be moving with it. We need to know where it is, and we need to understand how to adapt, because I see it over and over again where I get to organizations and they hit the hidden chasm and they go, we'll just have our people solve it. And their people are not equipped. And the conversation is no longer about how do we get our people to solve it. It's about how do we fire 30%, 40% of our staff because they are not skilled. They don't know how to merge newly acquired products. They don't know the new technologies that are required to fix their technical debt issues. They have no clue. And the saddest part is to say, oh, well, the solution is to get rid of them, is like saying, we screwed up. These people are now the victims of that. Of course, we say, well, they're also responsible for it. But come on, they don't have the time, nor were they incentivized.
There's a lot of dysfunction around that, because not only are they going to find themselves out of opportunity with no chance to have bettered themselves, the scar tissue left behind from those experiences are not confidence building. They create less clarity on their own skill set and where they could be successful. Not if they're doing, but the company environment is just kind of creating all kinds of damage around that. And to make it worse, I've seen situations where in organizations that are kind of in that mode, you've got leadership involved where actually even the upskilling where people have had opportunity to do it. I've seen things where there were managers actually undermining it more because of their own incompetence, not because they were doing it to be malicious, but they were actually taking people further away from that success direction, and they're becoming less enabled to become more technically sharp in a particular area. And then they would turn around and critique them at a performance time or want them put on a performance plan because they weren't X, Y, and Z. But I'm like, this manager was the person who actually kept blocking that 3 or 4 times in the row over a couple of years in one case. It's just all working in the wrong direction and putting the root cause at the wrong place. And I think, it seems to be difficult for organizations to think holistically sometimes. And I think in technology organizations, even though someone becomes a VP of something, they started out coding and they're proud of it, they were great at it, but they've never figured out how to really use a very different skill set inside a real leadership space where it's not about the technology most of the time. I mean, most organizations and their challenges, it's not a technology problem. It's almost always a people problem, leadership or wherever else.